Here we go. Welcome to Wabash Center webinars. This particular webinar is entitled Criss-crossing Boundaries of Structural and Personal White Faculty as Allies in the Academy. I am Nancy Lynn Westfield, Director of the Wabash Center. At the producer's desk is Carly Hollinsby, and Paul Myrie is the sound engineer. Viewers, please know that throughout the conversation, you are able to pose questions to our guests by emailing Paul Myrie at myrep@wabash.edu. That's MYHREP@wabash.edu. The many ways racism infuses the academy requires honesty and persistence from white faculty committed to justice, equity, and anti-racism. At the same time, Black faculty have been repeatedly disappointed by the lack of commitment from white faculty. So we're here to discuss this bit. On one hand, a time that is open to new paradigms, shifting paradigms, the possibility of working on the eradication of racism, knowing that we also bring, for those of us who are the targets of racism, story upon story where we have not been able to rely upon our white brothers and sisters in the academy. So our largest question in this conversation is, can white faculty members make intentional choices about committing to their colleagues and challenging their home institutions to become places where faculty and scholars of color may thrive and make use of their own authentic voices? So is justice just something in the ether, something in theory, or can we work on this in the places where we live as scholars? For this conversation, I have two brilliant women to be with me in this conversation. Welcome, Reverend Dr. Melanie L. Harris. Dr. Harris is founding director of African American Africana Studies and professor of religion and ethics at Texas Christian University. She is the author of many scholarly books and articles, including Eco-Womanism, Earth Honoring Faith, and another book, Gifts of Virtue, Alice Walker and Womanist Ethics. Welcome, Dr. Harris, to the conversation.
Thank you.
Dr. Harris's conversation partner is Reverend Dr. Jennifer Harvey. Dr. Harvey is a writer, speaker, and professor of religion at Drake University, where she also serves as faculty director for the Cru Scholars Program. Dr. Harvey's most recent book, Raising White Kids, Bringing Up Children in Racially Unjust America, is a New York Times bestseller. Dr. Harvey is also the author of Dear White Christians, for those still longing for racial reconciliation. Welcome, Dr. Harvey, to the show.
Thank you, Dr. Westfield. I'm so glad to be here.
And our viewers also need to know that Melanie and Jennifer are longtime friends, colleagues. They regularly offer anti-racism seminars and workshops in institutions across the country. So we are quite privileged, quite fortunate to have the two of you here in conversation about this very important practice in the academy. I'm going to go as far as to say it should be a practice in the academy. Yes. So to both of you, let's start with the basics. What's an ally, right? If we talk about white allies, what's an ally?
Thank you, Dr. Westfield, for getting us started. I think it's an excellent question. And for me, it's someone who shows up. It's a white academic, a white colleague who shows up in the trenches, so to speak. And I think as an academic, the trenches could be in mentoring or sharing important conversation with a faculty of color about what committees, for example, that they may want to think more deeply about. I think one of the traps that many faculty of color come into following graduate studies is they come into a tenure track position thinking they need to do everything. And of course, if they don't have kind of an intentional mentoring moments with several different colleagues to say, no, you don't need to sign up for a million different committees, you really need to focus on your research, then they can get trapped. And then 7 years later, in a very different situation. So I think showing up looks different for academics, but certainly one is in the area of mentoring. And I think that mentoring is not just a white ally showing up and saying, hey, let me take you to coffee. but that white ally having done the work of anti-racism themselves. What is it? What to at least think through? What might it feel like for a new faculty of color to be coming on board, and for a white person just to show up and say, "Let me take you to coffee"? That could be really intimidating. And a lot of times, what I experienced in my own career is that white colleagues had not even thought about the practice of anti-racism before they began to try to create a space of invitation. I didn't need that. What I needed was someone who was actually going to give me some solid wisdom on how to survive as a faculty of color in dangerous terrain.
Mm. So showing up, so Jennifer, keep going, because showing up also means advocacy. So if there are no people of color, or that Black person is not in the room when the white folks are talking, right, showing up might mean that you're advocating for the voices not in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, I was thinking as I was preparing and thinking about the relationship Dr. Harris and I have and the work we've done together, both in our own respective institutions, but also across the academy, one of the things that kept coming to my mind was this need for those of us who are white to commit to developing almost what I think of as like a spidey sense. Like, I think when I, you know, observe or am I in relationship with colleagues of color, I'm deeply aware that Black and brown faculty, Native American faculty have deep wisdom and frameworks for interpreting what's going on in a space when whiteness and white supremacy is kind of at work, but not necessarily announcing itself in explicit ways. And I think those of us that are white who would seek to be an ally always has to be a verb, is that we are working to develop a sort of spidey sense around that ourselves, despite our whiteness. So that when I'm thinking allyship, I'm thinking both personally and collegially, but also structurally. So that does mean advocacy, because in predominantly white institutions, many times there will not be upper leadership who's a person of color, a scholar of color, faculty of color in a room. And so how is anti-racism constantly in my various lanes of life at an institution centered in such a way that I'm thinking, okay, in this committee, how does anti-racism show up in support of the sort of persistence and thriving of colleagues of color? Okay, in this lane over here, how does that show up? In this lane over here, how does that show up? So it's like a constant query about how is centering anti-racist commitment manifesting in this hour of my day, in this particular work, in my institution, and then also higher level as I think about across the academy and partnering with colleagues across the academy to shift the academy.
That's helpful. Melanie and Jennifer, let's go back to Melanie. Tell us how you all started doing this work. This is difficult work to do. So what brought you all together, and something keeps you together to do this work, this anti-racism work?
Well, I think the answer to that question, both questions, what brought us together and what keeps us together in many ways is my mama's prayers. Mm-hmm. My mother is an educator and a retired educator now, but worked for more than 30 years in Denver, Colorado, with Denver Public Schools. And upon my own entry into thinking about graduate studies, I attended the AAR face-to-face meeting at that time, and had the occasion to meet Dr. Jennifer Harvey, who was then in her doctoral program. And I expressed to her that I was very interested in working with Emily Towns, who was then at Union. And Jennifer shared that she was working with Emily Towns and that she'd be happy to ask any questions. And she asked me again, you know, what's your last name? And I said, my name is Melanie Harris. And she said, oh, where are you from? I know that name. And we learned that Jennifer, who lived in Denver and was raised in Denver, went to South High School, which is where my mother served as a high school counselor. And in fact, my mother was Dr. Jennifer Harvey's high school counselor.
We did not know each other then, however. I mean, we, you know, Dr. Harris and I didn't, the younger Dr. Harris and I didn't.
As they say, it is a small world.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a delightful story. So then what happened?
Well, I'll give it over to Jen. You can tell the rest of the story.
Well, I mean, I think from there, you know, we developed a kind of friendship, although that was slower, like, you know, but certainly a deep care and respect for one another as doctoral students. And I think, you know, I was a couple years ahead timeline wise. And I think as I was learning in my doctoral work from womanist scholars, how to try to position myself in an ongoing way as an anti-racist committed human, that I think that some of my attempts early in my career there sort of shaped the context in which scholars coming behind me, perhaps, you know, sort of, I'm not even sure how to put it, but like we created an environment together at Union. I think womanists and some anti-racist committed feminists, not all of them, but in which we sort of tried to sort of model and be about what we saw womanist scholars modeling already in the world, which is like community, reciprocity, sort of, you know, sort of making a way, like making sure we're looking behind and saying, who's coming next? How can I make it easier? I think I was learning that as a doctoral student to some extent. And then once we graduated, Dr. Harris and I really started realizing that we both had deep anti-racist commitment. And I also, and I want, you know, Dr. Harris to speak to this if she will, like Dr. Harris has a profound commitment to and gift for, sometimes in ways I don't really understand why, and I think it might be a burden, for engaging white colleagues. And so we saw that we could sort of bring our shared and distinct gifts to spaces where, you know, predominantly white spaces, white folks need a lot of catch-up work, but there's always people of color in those spaces too who also need a harbor. And so we sort of started realizing, I think, and you can correct me, Dr. Harris, if I'm getting it wrong, but that there was like this unique set of skills and gifts we had, as well as our distinct identities and experiences, but which are also deeply together anti-racist, repair and reparations committed. And so we just started asking, could we bring some of those gifts to spaces? And the more we did that, the deeper our friendship and connection grew as well, of course, because this work is never just about teaching a lesson in an intellectual way. It's also about our human to human relationships. And I also know then sort of on the tail end, that that's also what constantly keeps me in it with great joy and hope, despite how hard it can be, because, well, I love Dr. Harris. I love, like, this is a beloved community I'm seeking to be part of, and I get to be part of in liminal moments. And so I think it's just sort of grown from that sort of ongoing journey that we've both decided to stay in together. Is that, how would you change or reshape that?
I love Dr. Harvey. I think it was a commitment that each of us made in part. And I think Union and the theological context that we were in really did actually influence both of our commitments very deeply. And I think that speaks to now, so many of us as theological educators, we don't always recognize how important creating the space is for our students as they're moving through the program. And it's vital. It was vital for someone like you, Jen, to actually have womanist mentors and models right in front of you. It was vital for you to study with Dr. James Cone. It was vital for then me as a student to recognize that the same reading that I had done, the same understanding I had, the same songs that I heard of Sweet Honey in the Rock, and hearing again Audre Lorde's voice, and just hearing all that was the same information that was being presented. And it was all being considered valid epistemology. And when you're supping together with that kind of knowledge, with that kind of base, then that kind of soul food and intellectual food, then you do, I think, develop these different connections with each other. There's a sense in which Union at that time also was just a beacon. We had a number of different African-American scholars there at the same time working. And that actually deeply influenced not only my decision to go to Union, but also it gave me a great model about what African-American religious scholars can be in conversation with each other. Not always agreeing, but always in conversation with each other. I think I also have to admit, I think I was deeply influenced by some of the models that those African-American scholars had with white scholars and colleagues themselves. So it was normative then for me to recognize that, oh, of course, everybody reads Cone's work, and then we have a conversation about it. It was normative for us to read Larry Rasmussen, and then everyone has conversation about it. And that kind of model of what collegiality looks like, I think was really excuse me, really, really important. Yeah. I think the journey is important. For me, as an intellect, one of the greatest gifts, I think, of your work, Jen, has been the model of reparations that's been presented in a lot of your work. And I think as I began to reflect on that, and even reflect on our experience together in teaching and learning and even leading together, it is different to be African American and to experience a moment where a white person gets it, right? And you actually are in relationship with an ally, in part because so much of my experience was with white people who were actually not allies, and even worse, right? Actually attackers, and very hostile. And so actually as an African American scholar, when I experienced allyship, that is with a mode in which I thought, it is possible. It is possible for a white person to actually recognize themselves and their whiteness, and to make a different decision on how they treat me and how they make decisions on how they walk in the world. And I think that gave me a deeper source of compassion, which was really important because my own experience was charted, as many womanists, unfortunately, charted with a lot of terror and trauma. So for me to be able to dig down in my own theological roots, and to be able to dig down into my own experience and come to a point of recognizing that there can still be compassion shared for any white person who's attempting to learn how to be an anti-racist, that compassion then needs to serve for everyone. And I think it's that compassion that's enabled me to stay in relationship with people who are still growing.
So stay on that line. That one of the my grandfather would say a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. So we know that one of the problems we face is something that both of you just stated in one way or another. That it is usually not in the white imagination, experience, nor curiosity to work at anti-racism work. So for the white person who puts it in their practices, their thoughts, even their curiosity, trying to foment an imagination around anti-racism work, that is so rare. I don't want that to be the work, right? To push people beyond just a modicum of, I'm a white person that starts it. And what I'm leading up to is some of the most difficult people I've had to work with in the academy are liberal white people who can say just the sentence, I am anti-racist, and then they do all modicum of terror and bigotry and destruction to African-American scholars and students in these classrooms. So what about the white liberals that have a little bit of information?
Oh, can I speak to that?
Yes.
So I just want to put a pin in that, because those of us who like to think of ourselves as white liberals, or even white progressives, right? Liberationists, the potential deadliness of that and the toxicity of it when it's sort of shows up as intellectual hubris is, I too have seen the kind of destruction and harm that causes. And I think one of the things that, this isn't exactly an answer to that, because I don't know quite how we tackle that, except to say that those of us that are on this call, for example, or listening to this webinar, say I'm the white person that's like, okay, I'm feeling, in a more intense commitment. I have a lot to learn. I know that. I sort of want to say things like, okay, then a first step, for example, is to deep dive all the reading, all of the, 100% of the time for the next however long, reading scholars of color, reading whatever terrain you read people of color, period. And in terms of actually sort of action and reach out, start with thinking about, are there white folks who seem like they're further along that they could sort of mentor and support me, as opposed to going immediately to that sort of, the only African-American scholar in the room, or the only, and say, hey, can I bounce some ideas off? Because we need some real-time growth. And we can cause so much personal and structural harm to colleagues of color when we take that immediately to them, right? And so, but we do have some capacity in the academy. We do have some folks who, if we're all on a journey, we have folks that we might point to and say, that person might be further along, maybe not perfect, still flawed, gonna be at this forever, but start the person-to-person engagement with folks who are also unjustly benefiting, frankly, from some of the insulation, like I still get, right? I have a different situation than Dr. Harris does. And so because of that, I have sort of deeper wells to draw from, because I'm not having to worry about my survival every day in the same way that Dr. Harris is. I'm not trying to speak for you, Dr. Harris, so and so I see it as my obligation and responsibility to be more of that in-person sort of mentor, engager, in ways that, though Dr. Harris also does do it all the time, frankly, our experiences in the academy are not the same. And so I just want to sort of, say, those of us that are white and sort of seeking to grow that spidey sense, right? We need to sort of see that there are folks out there who have been at this longer, who we can engage and reach out to before we sort of run around and think we know exactly what we should be doing. But you can always be reading and listening deeply, and centering people of color scholarship and activism in what we're taking in intellectually and spiritually and emotionally.
So Dr. Harris, I applaud you for the conversation with Jennifer for many years and for doing this work, because you and I both have many colleagues, African-American colleagues and colleagues of other races and ethnicity, who said, I don't want to be bothered teaching white people about racism. I just don't want to be bothered with it. Over my trauma, I don't trust them, not going to do the work. So for one or two, a handful of folks, African-American folks, folks of color, who say, some of us have to do this work. I'm very serious about this. My hat is off to you for having the courage and the tenacity to keep at this.
Thank you. That means a lot. It does. It is work. It is work. And I liken it to the same kind of garment that one puts on oneself in the morning. If one is looking, how do I become and walk in the line of anti-racism this day in my own person? I liken it very much to that. What is the garment that I need to place on my mind, on my body, on my spirit in order to work with white students today? And I have been working, most of my career is actually in predominantly white institutions, but I'm a graduate of Spelman College and HBCU. And because I teach mostly undergraduates, my common kind of tradition in my own self is to go back to my undergraduate experience, which was phenomenal. Because I was with powerful Black feminist scholars all of the time. And they were always encouraging and always nurturing. And the pedagogy that I have received and the mentoring I've received as a womanist scholar has been mostly nurturing my entire career. So in a way, I don't know how to not be that. It's more comfortable for me to be nurturing and encouraging. It's more in my spirit. I have had over the years, and it has taken years, and I appreciated Dr. Westfield, you mentioning, I think that we're in a particular historical moment. My white students now, literally in this moment, just this summer, having taught classes, are very much wanting to be anti-racist right now.
That's right.
Having not even been introduced to how to become an anti-racist during their entire matriculation through college.
Fall classes have to gear up for this conversation.
That's right.
This is where our students are, whether undergraduate or graduate, they will have these questions.
That's right. And had I not prepared myself to at least be open to the fact that they really do desire deep human transformation, deep intellectual transformation, then I would have cut off, I think, a moment for me to be more active in the movement, but also for them to be more active in the movement. And that's not to say that I privilege my white students, I do not. But it is to say that I also hold their own desires and their experience of right fragility. Really, those I value. I have had to train myself as a pedagogue and as a Black woman in the classroom on how to walk with white students moving through white fragility in profound ways. And this isn't even mentioning student perceptions, right? And what we call student perceptions or spot forms or evaluation of my teaching, and how that computes to, you know, most of scholars of color are often marked lower on their teaching evaluations simply because the student's perception of their body in person is biased. So I had to take all that into account, and then also take into account that this student actually may be really trying, but actually really stuck on their path, engaging white fragility. And I think with the rise of mental health issues among students and the rise of awareness about mental health, particularly in a context like the one I'm in, it's become more and more important for me as a teacher then in the classroom to recognize what might actually be anxiety, what might be depression, what might be suicidal tendencies, and what also might be white fragility.
Mm-hmm. So if you're on the committee that's looking at promotion and tenure, if you're an academic dean who's looking at evaluations of African-American faculty, faculty of color, if you are hearing comments by students saying there's something the white student will say, I don't like, then it sounds like one of the ways to be a white ally is to not take those comments at face value, but to talk to your colleagues of color, to talk to your African-American colleagues and hear their perception, not to problematize what is happening, but to say, how are you? How are you? Let's move into conversation about your teaching. Let's move into conversation about your promotion and your processes that you're in. That doesn't always happen with anti-racism agendas in mind, advocacy and ally in mind. It too often happens with, I heard something about you, and the students are probably right. The naive and unimaginative students, not that they're all naive and unimaginative, are probably right.
Can I add something to that, Dr. Westfield?
Please.
So again, I want to put a pin in that, especially for those of us on this call that are white, is that right, a check-in and support, especially if we've been in an institution longer, especially because that colleague is getting all kinds of scrutiny and sort of already being sort of observed typically in ways that do not take into account actually the scholarship of teaching and learning, in which we have massive evidence, like documented evidence of how often student evaluations are reporting what they're disclosing is racism, and they call it not effective teaching, right? And so in addition to that sort of awareness and check-in, also those of us who are white, not only on that promotion and tenure committee, do we have a moral obligation to bring up that scholarship. Like, again, we talked about this in the last webinar. We are scholars. We know how to use our minds and our intellect. We can develop capacity and look at that data and say, guess what, P&T committee, this is how we need to be interpreting these comments. And then the third lane, those of us who are white in an institution who talk about bemoaning that we cannot retain faculty of color, we need to then figure out who makes decisions about P&T guidelines, because Drake a couple of years ago actually started putting in some of that data in our P&T guidelines and saying, guess what? So we're learning structurally to educate the committee to say, you've got to have an interpretive framework for student evaluations that includes an anti-racist assessment. Those of us that are white at institutions have the capacity to organize, to push levers of power and decision-making to try and change those P&T guidelines. And even if we don't win the argument, we create a public scene about P&T guidelines and how innately sort of white and racist they are. And that in and of itself starts to become more effective. So that's the structural dimension of precisely then this personal dynamic and capacity we need to be developing.
Probably the only thing harder than being the one only person of color or African-American person on a faculty is being two people of color on an all-white faculty. Right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's
so
right.
For so many schools, the already minoritized colleague is the only one or one of the only two, some small percentage in faculty. And then the culturally insensitive or bigoted or racist questions and criticisms come then to say, what is wrong with this person? Why won't they stay here? What do you mean? The question is, how did they last for the 2 or 3 years that they survived you?
That's right. Yes, that's right.
Amen.
How inhospitable and hostile has the climate been, and for the person to have survived? But
I think, yeah.
Well, but all I'm saying, the lens that we're looking at these situations in this conversation is not the lens that it's usually looked at in most institutions. Melanie, go ahead. I interrupted.
But I think that's absolutely right, Lynn. I think that's the question is not usually, you know, what's wrong with us, and how is it that our space is so unwelcoming. The question is often, what's wrong with them? And that's a very racist question. What's wrong with that Black person? What's wrong with their hair? What's wrong with their teaching?
Usually the response is, they're not scholarly enough for us.
That's right.
We're more scholarly than they are.
That's right.
Yeah. Gotta be kidding me.
Yeah. And I think when you have that, I mean, when a scholar of color recognizes that kind of white supremacist thinking as normative in their department or normative in the institution, then it's usually at that point that there's this huge aha that's like, oh, I need to get out of here. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, but for many scholars, it's usually within the first 3 years that aha comes. And that is when, you know, if they're lucky, they're also in conversation with other scholars of color and other mentors of color. They've heard about Wabash. They get themselves in a pre-tenure. They find ways to be in conversation with others, not just about the possibility of leaving that particular institution, but then also dreaming big, right, about their work, their second, third book project, what they really want to do by the time they are a full professor, what impact do they want to have on the field? And then to ask themselves, can I do that at the institution that I'm actually in? Yeah. If I can't, then that's worth moving, right? Or at least attempting to get out. But if you can, and if there's a way that you can actually create space, change the curriculum, develop new courses, get grants, develop a kind of space or center or institute on that institution campus to create this conversation, the discourse around race, if you can do that, then there's a possibility of staying. And then it's a matter of, but you really do, I think as a scholar of color, you have to be so intentional very early about being in conversation and being in real true allyship with other scholars of color and other mentors of color. And that can be difficult, right? Because so much of our work and sometimes our experiences as graduate students is not positive. And we find ourselves leaning in or going inward and withdrawing from the very same folks, our own folk that we need to be in conversation with. So I think for any scholar of color, it just continues to be really important to go back to the folk. And, you know, if a white ally shows up, great, wonderful. But I was always taught, don't depend on that. Don't depend on that.
No, don't depend on that. And don't think you have to martyr yourself for the academy. You are not called to this work to give your life for the academy. But there's so many scholars have done that. But anyway, for viewers, if you would like to ask our brilliant guests a question, you can email your question to Paul Myrie. That's myrep@wabash.edu. MYHREP@wabash.edu. One more question or one more piece of conversation before we go to the questions from Paul. What about trust, right? So the two of you have established this relationship of trust. Do I need to trust my ally, or is that a lot to ask as a person of color? Do white allies just do your work? Don't ask me to, because trust seems so intimate to me. I'm not ready to move into intimacy. Just do something for me, and then I will decide. But see, this is where people don't like this. The white people don't like that the Black people of color get to decide if I trust you or not, even if you've done something good for me. It's too often a quid pro quo or some sort of transactional, you know. What about trust?
Well, this is real talk from me. I am confident I am confident there are African-American people at my institution who do not trust me. Like, and my focal point, like for whatever set of reasons, including, you know, maybe as simple as they don't know me, they're newish. Like, why would you, right? And that can't, for me, that cannot be the point. I mean, of course, if I get to a point in my life where somebody in my life, I've behaved in such a way that for whatever set of reasons they've decided trust is something I might be worthy of, that's beautiful. And I couldn't imagine Dr. Harris and I could be friends if there wasn't a modicum of trust, right? So, but that's different. And our relationship is different than like the relationship I have with, you know, X, Y, and Z number of folks at my institution. And so for me, allyship, it has to be deeply responsive and responsible. It has to be accountable. So it's not just sort of white folks off sort of thinking we're going to fix things for, right? But at the same time, it is not about the individual personalities of different people in the space that I work in, because we're all unique and different individual personalities. There's all kinds of Black and brown people at my institution, some of whom I like and some of whom I don't, right? And so just like the white folks there, some of whom I like, some of whom, so we can't tangle it up institutionally and structurally in terms of these questions of, because I have to be clear about why I'm doing what I'm doing irregardless, but that's not the same thing as saying I'm not accountable for doing it well, and in both, you know, strategic relationship and also an attempt to be sort of deeply relationally accountable, right? But it can't be about like, this person doesn't want to have coffee with me because I'm white, and so therefore it's just like, white people do get hung up on that because we often want accolades from people of color, right? And I deeply appreciate why we do, because this work is scary and hard and the F-ups are so all over the place. But part of our growth as anti-racist committed humans who are also white is to literally grow through that. We have to grow through that, and we only grow through it by doing it and doing it and doing it.
I would echo that. I think the practice is key. I think every white colleague who wants to be an anti-racist, is trying to be an anti-racist, has to ask themselves the question every day, what am I doing today, right? In the modes where I can have influence. But also commit to a practice. And this gets a little bit, Dr. Westfield, to a question you were asking earlier about practice, right? Yeah. And for me, and I think, Dr. Harvey, you might also share on this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my reading of your work also suggests that there's an ethical malformation that has happened in many white people. And particularly as a work and scholar in religion, that malformation is connected to, an ethical malformation is connected to one's theology, one's religion, and one's practice. So oftentimes, I think for white allies that I have seen move through the growth, what I've seen is literally a change in their spiritual practice. Yes. Their own core of who they are. They go back and they reflect on their own upbringing. Who was it who taught them how to take on a white supremacist paradigm? And who was it who taught them along the way in their childhood, as a teenager, as a young adult, how to use their whiteness and to use their white privilege to get the job, to get the opportunity, and to limit opportunities for scholars. So I think that kind of reflection then allows a white colleague to look at themselves. And I think my experience has been that in the academy, we don't have a lot of time for self-reflection. That's a womanist tenet. But that's not necessarily something that comes out of white scholarship or white academy, so to speak. So that self-reflection, I think, is key. And that self-reflection, I think, leads then to a kind of practice. And I would say spiritual practice, but one could also name it as an ethical practice, an intellectual practice. That then opens oneself to recognize not just how they're acting, but how they may also be perceived, particularly by people who work down the hall from them, people who are on Zoom calls with them, people who have spent lots of time with them. They may not be breathing the same way that you are.
I also have witnessed in my own anti-racism work with my students and my colleagues that there is an unexpected grieving that happens when white people discover their own malformation, their own miseducation. There is a grieving of having been lied to, and that grieving is immensely unexpected. That there was a sense of, I just thought I would speak up for what was right. I did not know that I would uncover that I've been lied to all my life.
Yes.
By people who I love and trusted.
Yes.
So it oftentimes is something much bigger, emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, than what people bargained for.
Yes.
This is hard work for a reason.
Yeah. And that healing balm looks different, right? And
Yeah.
I think many white scholars that I know have moved through that find that suddenly the voice of Aretha Franklin becomes very important for them. Mm-hmm. Or they suddenly have an interest in African American spirituals. Mm-hmm. They want to go back to Native American and Native Indigenous voices, literally voices, singing, because there's something healing in that. And then if one's not careful, that white supremacy just creeps right on in, and immediately it's appropriation. And there's an article published in their name without any reference or footnotes to any scholars of color who have ever done anything on. So that, it's tricky. It's tricky.
Dr. Harris. Lord have mercy.
Yeah.
And then Christopher Columbus discovered America all over again.
Oh my.
Lord have mercy.
Names are published and books and articles are published, and they are brilliant about somebody else's cultural work.
Yeah. And I think what's so, scary about that in this moment, it's hopeful, but also scary, is we really have to bring an anti-racist paradigm to the work that we're doing now in this moment. This fall, in the next 2 weeks, before we all start going back and getting our classes together and getting our pedagogies together, we really do have to do some of this work about not just looking at the syllabus, right, and thinking about who the scholars of color are on our syllabus, but we have to really do this work about where does the movement show up in my class this fall. And I know we are moving through a pandemic. And many of us are moving through many pandemics, including white supremacy. But this is the time. This is the time for all of us to be invited very deeply into anti-racist commitments, even if you just try.
You can't say I'm teaching systematic theology, so the movement can't be in my syllabus. You can't say I'm teaching Introduction to Bible, something, so this doesn't have anything to do with Black Lives Matter. I don't care what course you're teaching. This has to show up in your course, because it does, right? It is a part of your course. And if you can't make those connections, connect those dots, ask somebody who does connect those dots, because those dots are absolutely connected.
Yeah. Can I offer, for folks who are, for those of us who are white, who hit that grief point, which even I think scholars and not even students, right, are having a moment of like that, with the deep risks of appropriation that come when we go, those show up in part because this is a generational bereftness. Like, I've been naming more directly in my own life in recent years how my ancestors not only caused harm to Indigenous people and African peoples, right, but in the process of doing that, dehumanized their descendants, right? And so I wake up, right, and I go, oh my God, how do I heal from that we have all inherited this system. And so the first move, because my ancestors did not create it, right, is Aretha Franklin or Native voices, right? So for those that are hearing a resonance of the pain of this moment, who like in this way, even before the semester, pick up for yourself My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa, I think it's Menakem. I might be mispronouncing his last name, Menakem, My Grandmother's Hands, because he is brilliantly talking about legacies of trauma that white supremacy and colonial settlerism bequeathed all of us, but that those of us who are, he calls it white body supremacy, it's like a trauma, then we traumatize others because we've inherited the trauma. And it's radically reframing how I'm understanding some of that grief point that you were naming, Dr. Westfield. that we do have to resource and respond to, and recognize there's a connection between Black trauma and white trauma. Absolutely. Even though then white folks go on to be perpetrators, right? And so we can interrupt those cycles, but, and some of the exercises in that book would be brilliant for white folks really grieving or touching that grief in this moment, to even just start to practice as we prepare to teach. So my grandmother's hands, I cannot, it's riveting. It's powerful.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Myrie, I have no doubt that your email is jumping and people are asking questions.
Let's just say it's off the hook with the amount of questions that are coming in. And I thought that might be the case when I knew these two were going to be joining you today. I'm going to pick one of the questions. There are so many, I don't think we'll be able to cover them all. I'll pick this one. I'd love it if the panelists would be willing to share some concrete examples of themes of white progressive toxicity, the types of things white liberals probably don't realize they're doing, the less obvious stuff.
Dr. Harris, you want to take that? You want me to try?
Go ahead.
First?
Go ahead. I'm thinking through some examples.
So two I would offer. One is when I think about predominantly white spaces, so I'm picturing like a faculty senate meeting, and I wouldn't describe my institution as being progressive necessarily, but there are a lot of folks there who would probably appropriately be understood as white progressives or white liberals. And if I think about a faculty senate meeting, there's something that happens when white folks get together, even really good intentioned ones, even the progressives, where we just like bond with each other in a way. And like, for example, I'm thinking about what Dr. Harris was talking about in terms of scholars of color navigating the academy. Those of us who are white tend to go, oh, my institution, and we sort of quickly identify it with it, right? And develop kind of a love for it that is just sort of over-identified without the layer of awareness and suspicion that we can only love it in that way because we are white. And so there's something about that creates a toxicity then when we're in faculty spaces, for example, where we don't constantly kind of step back a little bit, integrate at every step. What's actually happening here? What's actually happening here? And if I was a differently racialized human in this space, how would this space feel? And even if I don't have the answers to that, the failure to do that creates toxicity immediately, because whiteness is so pervasive that if we aren't always assuming it's in the room and asking about it, it's sort of, before we know it, it's sort of taken on a life of its own. So that's not very concrete, but then I'll give you a really concrete example. This happened to Dr. Harris and I actually. We were doing some work with a progressive group. I'm gonna try and really make it as neutral enough that we don't expose anybody, but that this kind of thing happens a lot when we work together. We always, in our work together, we recognize white folks and folks of color have different work and space they need, even while we also bring folks together. We work very diligently and carefully with this paradigm. And we had done this work for 2 days with this progressive group that was predominantly white, but there were a lot of people of color in the space. And I had taken the white folks into a caucus space with just the white folks to work. And Dr. Harris had taken people of color into a space to do some of the work that they needed to do. And as often happens, one of the things I think transpires when Dr. Harris convenes folks of color in this space is that it's a radically different kind of conversation, because much of the terror and trauma that folks are navigating, even with white progressives, comes up, right? And so we're in this space, and literally, like, I had like 50 white folks in the room, and the person who'd hired us, it was time for lunch. And we always make sure that the people of color in the space get the room that we're all working in, the nice room, right, to do their work together. Well, they weren't done. And Dr. Harris and I have careful mechanisms around how she communicates to me when they're done and ready for us. They weren't done because they were needing to be present to some things. And the folks who'd hired us, the white folks, she kept saying to me, it's time for lunch. It's time for lunch. And I was like, listen, they're not done, right? And that kind of dynamic often happens. It's very toxic, right? She was ready to, but in that particular space, I literally at a certain point had to put my body in front of the door, because she said to me, if we don't get lunch on time, it's a worker justice issue. They need to be done. And I put my body in front of the door and I said, if you walk into that room right now, you're going to undo all of the work we did that was so hard and slow for the last 24 hours. It will be done. And it was emotion. Like I had to it was hard. So anyway, and that's an example of white toxicity. Like saying you're going to respect and center Black and brown voices, but when they tell you what they're needing, going, oh, that's not on the agenda for today though. We need to get lunch, right? That kind of dynamic happens often with white cultures as we engage in cross-racial work.
I think the faculty's meeting setting is probably where white culture shows up, and that can be particularly dangerous and maybe almost invisible to white progressives. Basic things like silencing the person of color or repeating, what they've just said from your own white voice, so that all the other white colleagues associate the idea, it was probably brilliant, with your whiteness instead of with the scholar of color. These are some basics, right? Not creating a space, placing a scholar of color who may be the only or one of only a few in the basement of a building.
Right.
Indicating, or their class in the basement of a building, indicating that we don't really want you here. And we have to have you here because of affirmative action or whatever. Space, time, invitations. The invitations for all faculty and even informal gatherings, right, should be open to everyone. And I think, and depending on the climate and depending on the historical moment and the kind of racial charge that may be going on, particularly for leaders as chairs, deans, I think this is a good moment to send an extra email and to extend yourself even further and just simply say, I may be really in need of good practice, but I'm trying to practice a way of anti-racism, and I simply want to say to you, I have an open door policy, and if there are any areas that I can assist you with, as I am learning how to be an anti-racist myself, I really do want you to reach out. In my 15-year career at this particular institution, I have the pleasure of having seen one chair out of 4 now practice this, and it's made a huge, huge difference. But in their whiteness, they actually take responsibility for their whiteness and recognize that there's a whole script, a whole narrative about how leaders who are white have treated scholars of color in the past, and they have made a concerted effort to shift that. And that's a lot of change that has to take place, and that's a lot of work.
So my example might be petty, but one of my petty things is when 2 or 3 or 4 scholars of color are standing in the hallway, talking and laughing together. Invariably, a white colleague will come up and say, and I quote, "You all sound like you're having too much fun."
Mm.
Mm.
Right?
Mm.
So in that moment, you have just told us, not us, you recognize that we're Black and that we're somehow outside of the bounds of what is supposed to happen here in the academy. That is a scripted standard response to people of color getting together in public in the academy for a white person to then say to those people, have the audacity to say to all of us standing in the group, "You're having too much fun."
Mm.
So part of that example is anti-racist work is to check your scripted responses. Stop saying these routinized, rote things that you say don't mean anything when they mean everything in the moment that they're inflicted upon us.
Mm. Thank you for sharing.
One more question, Paul. Time is running. Oh my goodness. We should have scheduled 2 hours.
I know. The questions alone could take an entire day.
We'll come back.
Okay, that sounds great.
Yes.
Super. This question is kind of a more personal question, but I thought it resonates with where we were headed. This is a question. One thing that might be helpful to hear is when something, if it did, erupted between the two of you and how you both responded, handled it, we're open to staying connected. The person goes on to say this work is hard. When was trust ruptured, and how did you rebuild it? And if it was, I mean, that's an assumption on the questioner's part.
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't remember the details of what it was, but I remember the experience of waiting for Dr. Harvey to call, because I knew she would. If she went back to herself, her authentic self, and her own commitment to allyship, I knew that she would call and say, I messed up. Or at least say, the communication is really, really bad, and I don't know exactly what went wrong, but I'm trying and I'm working at it, and I just need you to stay. And that call, when it happened, because it did, that changed everything. It changed everything, because I knew I was working with a person who was really committed to me as a person of color. She was committed to the work, and she was also committed to being humble enough to say, in my whiteness, I may have erred. Now, I seem to remember that I too had done something wrong and had also contributed to some of the confusion. So it gave us the opportunity to talk. But I think I do remember feeling so overwhelmed by the moment that I didn't know what to say. And I definitely was not picking up the phone first.
Yeah.
So I think that, I think as a white ally, and I think generally about this, and as someone who does intra and interreligious work, we often get so enamored by our own ego and power as academics. And humility is something that is not a normal value for many of us as scholars. And it takes a deep, deep commitment to humility and a humble spirit to be an anti-racist, particularly if you're working as a white person. And I remember going through all of the structural, kind of racism that was at play in this interaction. I remember even thinking about the personal kind of issues and themes that were raised. And I remember thinking, I'm not the first person who needs to lean in here. I remember that. And Dr. Harvey did call. And that call opened up, again, a conversation. But I think the humility is key.
I really appreciate that question too, because it gives us a chance to rename that, like, all of us on this journey will continue to cause harm and make mistakes. And I'm thinking, I don't know if it's the same moment that Dr. Harris is speaking of, but I do distinctly remember a time where, because we were working with a group, and many times groups, and this happens in faculty spaces too, so even if it's just your institution, will kind of, especially if there is a kind of interracial team and kind of allyship, will really stare hard at the white person in the space to try and get them to go along when there's sort of institutional. And I do remember a time that there was some of that happening, and that in my sort of attempt to deflect and push it back, I used one of those scripted kind of lines that you were just referring to, Dr. Westfield, to kind of push back, but also deflect some of what was actually happening instead of just naming it. And I remember thinking, even in the moment as it happened, wow, I did this thing. I don't know if it caused harm to Dr. Harris, but I do know that she's carrying things in this moment that I'm not. And just sort of that sort of, again, I mean, humility is the word. Thank you for that, Dr. Harris. Like, we have to ongoingly commit to a practice of humility and a willingness to even just say, I need to check in because I'm not even sure I understood or could handle all the dynamics in this space. And so I may not have done as good of a job as you deserved and needed in that moment. And I'm open to hearing that, even though it hurts to have caused harm. And so I just think we have to really not give ourselves grace and say we don't expect better of ourselves, but give ourselves the recognition that we're going to need grace, but grace cannot be cheap. Grace can never be cheap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a wonderful concept in Buddhist practice called fierce compassion. And it's a kind of compassion that works best by holding the other accountable to their best self. And so that frame, I think, allows there to be additional work and more work to always be done. It doesn't cut the person off. It also doesn't allow one to fall into white guilt, right, and stay there for a year where people are going up for tenure. That's also not appropriate. And so I do think that fierce compassion, holding yourself in fierce compassion in terms of accountability and an ethic to continue doing the work, but also holding others in fierce compassion is helpful.
Reverend Dr. Melanie Harris, Reverend Dr. Jennifer Harvey, I thank you for this, I'm going to say, life-changing conversation for many people. That preparation for classes in the fall are critically important to bring in Black Lives Matter, to bring in anti-racist practices, to become better scholars, better teachers, better citizens of democracy, better human beings, to dispel the myth that there are inferior and superior people on the planet. And denounce that is wrong thinking, and we're shedding that kind of miseducation in our own classrooms. So I thank you, sisters, for this very difficult work and for teaching us as you go. Thank you also to Carly and Paul, my staff, my support staff, my producer and sound engineer. To our viewers, please know that we both record the webinars and put them on the Wabash Center website, as well as audio and video in both formats. You heard, viewers and listeners, that Melanie Harris and Jennifer Harvey have promised to come back and do this again. We have it on tape.
Wonderful.
We will hold you to that.
Awesome.
I say that selfishly because I like hanging out with both of you, so it's something for my own. For my own conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Westfield. This has been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Westfield, both of you. Thank you, Dr. Harris.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Harvey.
And we're out. What a terrific conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My goodness, what a gift. Wow.